Hey there, friends. Pastor Jason here. Glad you can join me for daily devotionals. We are in Leviticus. We're in Leviticus 13 and 14. Gonna be longer. If you need a second cup of coffee, go grab one. Uh, it's about leprosy and the plague. So, I know that might not seem relevant to us, but we're gonna take 1 second at the end and we're gonna look at how much greater Christ is than what's prescribed here in Leviticus. And also, it's good for us to read through it. I mean, again, this whole process, we're reading through the Old Testament chronologically. Sit through it. It's going to be about 10 minutes or so, 15 minutes. And just sit and read the Word and start to recognize how important the priests were in a time period where, frankly, a deadly disease, a deadly contagious disease, was going to be important to keep away from the people of Israel. So, here we go, chapter 13, verse 1. You'll forgive me if I look down a bit. A lot of reading today. Here we go. The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron. When a person has a swelling, scab, or spot on the skin of his body, it becomes a disease on the skin of his body. He is to be brought to Aaron the priest or to one of his sons, the priests. The priest will examine the infection on the skin of his body. If the hair in the infection has turned white and the infection appears to be deeper than the skin of his body, it is a skin disease. After the priest examines him, he must pronounce him unclean. But if the spot on the skin of his body is white and does not appear to be deeper than the skin, and the hair in it has not turned white, the priest must quarantine the infected person for 7 days. The priest will then re-examine him on the seventh day. If he sees that the infection remains unchanged and has not spread on the skin, the priest must quarantine him for another 7 days. The priest will examine him again on the seventh day. If the infection has faded and it has not spread on the skin, the priest is to pronounce him clean. It is a scab. The person is to wash his clothes and will become clean. But if the scab spreads further on his skin after he has presented himself to the priest for his cleansing, he must present himself again to the priest. The priest will examine him, and if the scab has spread on the skin, then the priest must pronounce him unclean. He has a skin disease. When a skin disease develops on a person, he is to be brought to the priest. The priest will examine him. If there is a white swelling on the skin that has turned the hair white, and there is a patch of raw flesh in the swelling, it is a chronic disease on the skin of his body. The priest must pronounce him unclean. He need not quarantine him, for he is unclean. But if the skin disease breaks out all over the skin so that it covers all the skin of the infected person from his head to his feet, so far as the priest can see, the priest will look, and if the skin disease has covered his entire body, he is to pronounce the infected person clean. Since he has turned totally white, he is clean. But whenever raw flesh appears on him, he will be unclean. When the priest examines the raw flesh, he must pronounce him unclean. Raw flesh is unclean. It is a skin disease. But if the raw flesh changes and turns white, he must go to the priest. The priest will examine him, and if the infection has turned white, the priest must pronounce the infected person clean. He is clean. When a boil appears on the skin of one's body and it heals, and a white swelling or a reddish white spot develops where the boil was, the person must present himself to the priest. The priest will make an examination, and if the spot seems to be beneath the skin and the hair in it has turned white, the priest must pronounce him unclean. It is a skin disease that has broken out in the boil. But when the priest examines it, if there is no white hair in it, and it is not beneath the skin but it is faded, the priest must quarantine him 7 days. If it spreads further on the skin, the priest must pronounce him unclean. It is an infection. But if the spot remains where it is and does not spread, it is only the scar from the boil. The priest is to pronounce him clean. When there is a burn on the skin of one's body produced by fire, the patch made raw by the burn becomes reddish white or white. The priest is to examine it. If the hair in the spot has turned white and the spot appears to be deeper than the skin, it is a skin disease that is broken out in the burn. The priest must pronounce him unclean. It is a skin disease. But when the priest examines it, if there is no white hair in the spot and it is not beneath the skin but is faded, the priest must quarantine him 7 days. The priest will re-examine him on the 7th day. If it has spread further on the skin, the priest must pronounce him unclean. It is a skin disease. But if the spot has remained where it was and has not spread on the skin but is faded, it is the swelling from the burn. The priest is to pronounce him clean, for it is only the scar from the burn. When a man or a woman has an infection on the head or chin, the priest must examine the infection. If it appears to be deeper than the skin and the hair in it is yellow and sparse, the priest must pronounce the person unclean. It is a scaly outbreak, a skin disease of the head or chin. When the priest examines the scaly infection, if it does not appear to be deeper than the skin and there is no black hair in it, the priest must quarantine the person with the scaly infection for 7 days. The priest will re-examine the infection on the 7th day. If the scaly outbreak has not spread and there is no yellow hair in it and it does not appear to be deeper than the skin, the priest must shave himself, but not the person must shave himself, but not shave the scaly area. Then the priest must quarantine the person who has the scaly outbreak for another 7 days. The priest will examine the scaly outbreak on the 7th day, and if it has not spread on the skin and does not appear to be deeper than the skin, the priest is to pronounce the person clean. He is to wash his clothes and he will be clean. But if the scaly outbreak spreads further on the skin after his cleansing, the priest is to examine the person. If the scaly outbreak has spread on the skin and the priest does not need to look for yellow hair, the person is unclean. But if as far as he can see the scaly outbreak remains unchanged and black hair grows in it, then it has healed. He is clean. The priest is to pronounce the person clean. When a man or a woman has white spots on the skin of the body, the priest is to make an examination. If the spots on the skin of the body are dull white, it is only a rash that has broken out on the skin. The person is clean. If a man loses the hair of his head, he is bald, but he is clean. Or if he loses the hair at his hairline, he is bald on his forehead, but he is clean. But if there is a reddish-white infection on the bald head or forehead, it is a skin disease breaking out on his head or forehead. The priest is to examine him, and if the swelling or the infection on his bald head or forehead is reddish-white, like the appearance of a skin disease on his body, the man is afflicted with a skin disease. He is unclean. The priest must pronounce him unclean. The infection is on his head. The person afflicted with an infectious skin disease to have his clothes torn and his hair hanging loose, and he must cover his mouth and cry out, "Unclean, unclean." He will remain unclean as long as he has the infection. He is unclean. He must live alone in a place outside the camp. If a fabric is contaminated with mildew in wool or linen or linen fabric, in the warp or woof of linen or wool, or in leather or anything made of leather, and if the contamination is green or red in the fabric, leather, the warp, the woof, or any leather article, it is a mildew contamination and is to be shown to the priest. The priest is to examine the contamination and quarantine the contaminated fabric for 7 days. The priest is to re-examine the contamination on the 7th day. If it has spread in the fabric, the warp, the woof, or the leather, regardless of how it is used, the contamination is harmful mildew. It is unclean. He is to burn the fabric, the warp or woof in wool or linen, or any leather article which is contaminated. Since it is harmful mildew, it must be burned up. When the priest examines it, if the contamination has not spread in the fabric, the warp or woof, or any leather article, the priest is to order whatever is contaminated to be washed and quarantined for another 7 days. After it has been washed, the priest is to re-examine the contamination. If the appearance of the contaminated article has not changed, it is unclean. Even though the contamination has not spread, you must burn up the fabric. It is a fungus on the front or back of the fabric. If the priest examines it and the contamination has faded after it has been washed, he must cut the contaminated section out of the fabric, the leather, or the warp or woof. But if it reappears in the fabric, the warp or woof, or any leather article, it has broken out again. You must burn up whatever is contaminated. But if the contamination disappears from the fabric, the warp or woof, or any leather article which has been washed, it is to be washed again, and it will be clean. This is the law concerning a mildew contamination in wool or linen fabric, warp or woof, or any leather article, in order to pronounce it clean or unclean. Leviticus 14. The Lord spoke to Moses, "This is the law concerning the person afflicted with the skin disease on the day of his cleansing. He is to be brought to the priest. He will go outside the camp and examine him. If the skin disease has disappeared from the afflicted person, the priest will order that 2 live clean birds, cedar wood, scarlet yarn, and hyssop be brought for the one who is to be cleansed. Then the priest will order that one of the birds to be slaughtered over fresh water in a clay pot. He is to take the live bird together with the cedar wood, scarlet yarn, and hyssop, and dip them all into the blood of the bird that was slaughtered over the fresh water. He will then sprinkle the blood 7 times on the one who is to be cleansed from the skin disease. He is to pronounce him clean and release the live bird over the open countryside. The one who is to be cleansed must wash his clothes, shave off all his hair, and bathe with water. He is clean. Afterward, he may enter the camp, but he must remain outside his tent for 7 days. He is to shave off all his hair again on the 7th day, his head, his beard, his eyebrows, and the rest of his hair. He is to wash his clothes and bathe himself with water. He is clean. On the 8th day, he must take 2 unblemished male lambs, an unblemished year-old ewe lamb, a grain offering of 3 quarts of fine flour mixed with olive oil, and 1/3 of a quart of olive oil. The priest who performs the cleansing will place the person who is to be cleansed together with these offerings before the Lord at the entrance to the tent of meeting. The priest is to take 1 male lamb and present it as a restitution offering, along with 1/3 quart of olive oil. He must wave them as a presentation offering before the Lord. He is to slaughter the male lamb at the place in the sanctuary area where the sin offering and burnt offering are slaughtered. For like the sin offering, the restitution offering belongs to the priest. It is especially holy. The priest is to take some of the blood from the restitution offering and put it on the lobe of the right ear of the one to be cleansed, on the thumb of his right hand, and on the big toe of his right foot. Maybe that sounds familiar. Then the priest will take some of the 1/3 quart of olive oil and pour it into his left palm. The priest will dip with his right finger into the olive oil in his left palm and sprinkle some of the olive oil and finger 7 times before the Lord. From the oil remaining in his palm, the priest will put some on the lobe of his right ear of the one to be cleansed, on the thumb of his right hand, and on the big toe of his right foot, on top of the blood of the restitution offering. What is left of the oil in the priest's palm is to put on the head of the one to be cleansed. In this way, the priest will make atonement for him before the Lord. The priest must sacrifice the sin offering and make atonement for the one to be cleansed from his uncleanness. Afterward, he will slaughter the burnt offering. The priest is to offer the burnt offering and the grain offering on the altar. The priest will make atonement for him, and he will be clean. But if he is poor and cannot afford these, he is to take 1 male lamb for a restitution offering to be waved in order to make atonement for him, along with 2 quarts of fine flour mixed with olive oil for a grain offering, 1/3 of a quart of olive oil, and 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons, whatever he can afford, one to be a sin offering and the other to be a burnt offering. On the 8th day, he is to bring these things for his cleansing to the priest at the entrance to the tent of meeting for the Lord. the priest will take the male lamb for the restitution offering and the 1/3 quart of olive oil and wave them as a presentation offering before the Lord. After he slaughters the male lamb for the restitution offering, the priest is to put some of the blood of the restitution offering and put it on the right earlobe of the one to be cleansed, and on his right thumb on the thumb of his right hand, and on the big toe of his right foot. Then the priest will pour some of the oil into his left palm, and with his right finger the priest will sprinkle some of the oil in his left palm 7 times before the Lord. The priest will put some of the oil in his palm on the right earlobe of the one to be cleansed, on the thumb of his right hand, and on the big toe of his right foot, on the same place as the blood of the restitution offering. What is left of the oil in the priest's palm he is to put on the head of the one to be cleansed to make an atonement for him before the Lord. He must then sacrifice one type of what he can afford, either turtle doves or young pigeons, one as a sin offering and the other as a burnt offering, sacrificing what he can afford together with the grain offering. In this way, the priest will make atonement before the Lord for the one to be cleansed. This is the law for someone who has a skin disease and cannot afford the cost of his cleansing. Verse 33. The Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron, when you enter the land of Canaan that I am giving you as a possession, and I place a mildew contamination in the house and the land you possess, the owner of the house is to come and tell the priest, something like mildew contamination has appeared in my house, and the priest must order them to clear the house before he enters to examine the contamination, so that nothing in the house becomes unclean. Afterward, the priest will come to examine the house. He will examine it, and if the contamination in the walls of the house consists of green or red indentations that appear to be beneath the surface of the wall, the priest is to go outside the house to its doorway and quarantine the house for 7 days. The priest is to return on the 7th day and examine it. If the contamination has spread on the walls of the house, the priest must order that the stones of the contamination be pulled out and thrown into an unclean place outside the city. He is to have the inside of the house completely scraped, and the plaster that is scraped off must be dumped in an unclean place outside the city. Then they must take different stones to replace the former ones and take additional plaster to replaster the house. If the contamination appears in the house after the stones have been pulled out and after the house has been scraped and replastered, the priest must come and re-examine it. If the contamination has spread in the house, it is harmful mildew. The house is unclean. It must be torn down with its stones, its beams, and all its plaster, and taken outside the city to an unclean place. Whoever enters the house during the days, any of the days the priest quarantines it, will be unclean until evening. Whoever lies down in the house is to wash his clothes. Whoever eats in it is to wash his clothes. But when the priest comes and examines it, if the contamination has not spread in the house after it was replastered, he is to pronounce the house clean, and because the contamination has disappeared. He is to take 2 birds, cedar wood, scarlet yarn, and hyssop to purify the house, and he is to slaughter one of the birds over a clay pot containing fresh water. He will take the cedar wood, the hyssop, scarlet yarn, and the live bird, dip them in blood of the slaughtered bird and the fresh water, and sprinkle the house 7 times. He will purify the house with the blood of the bird, the fresh water, the live bird, the cedar wood, the hyssop, and the scarlet yarn. Then he is to release the live bird into the open countryside outside the city. In this way he will make atonement for the house, and it will be clean. This is the law for any skin disease or mildew, for a scaly outbreak, for mildew in clothing or on a house, and for a swelling scab or spot, to determine when something is unclean or clean. This is the law regarding skin disease and mildew. Woo! It's a long one today. They were kind of together, so I wanted to read them together. Let me grab a sip. So, what do we take away in this day of modern medicine? It's easy to kind of like just simply set it aside, but we shouldn't. We shouldn't. First off, leprosy, the plague, these sorts of things would have been super detrimental early on to this group of Israelites who are traveling through, trying to grow and become as numerous as the stars, as the grains of the sands, right? So it was super important for the priest to be able to determine you're clean, you're unclean. If you're unclean, get outside the city. Don't contaminate anyone else as best we can. Let's make atonement for you and make atonement to the Lord after several days and re-examining and these sorts of things. Notice it was on the person who had the scab, the spot, the mildew in their house to go to the priest and say, hey, examine this, right? It wasn't on the priest to wander around and discover. It was on the impetus of the person. Maybe a neighbor might come and tell them, hey, you need to go see the priest or whatever. But the impetus was on the person to go and be honest with what's going on in their own lives. The other thing I would point out, like I hinted at earlier before we started reading, we see how Christ is different and better than here in the Old Testament in Leviticus. Because we know in the Synoptic Gospels, Christ heals the lepers. We don't see any, hey, priest, go heal this person. They're just to go off on their own. And when the disease ends, then I'm going to redetermine whether you're clean or not. Christ instead heals the lepers. And then even in Matthew 10, where he sends out the apostles, what does he do? Matthew 10:8, he tells them, heal, raise the dead, heal the lepers. Like, he gives authority to heal these diseases. We have a great, powerful God in Christ Jesus alone. He is our atonement. He was our sacrifice. He is the one who heals us. I pray that you would be able to be blessed in Leviticus 13 and 14. And I hope that you are able to be a blessing to those around you. Maybe reach out to someone who's hurt, or maybe in the hospital, or maybe you know someone who has a loved one in the hospital. Reach out to them and be a blessing. Bring grace and peace into that situation. With that, I hope you have a great weekend. I'll see you on tomorrow when we look at Psalms. We'll be in Psalms 111 and 112. Have a great day.